we'll go ahead and continue with the session, and our next chapter is Bab Hawl al-Mawt wa Shiddatih, which is like the chapter of like the terror and severity of death. And so today's session, obviously when you hear the topic death, right, instantly your mind goes to like negative thoughts or fear, or you reflect on life, right? But to focus the session, to make it productive and learn something new, we want to answer like 5 main questions, I would say, to summarize the Islamic attitude towards death. So first of all, the question of, do we like death or do we hate it? Secondly, do we fear it or do we accept it? Third, are we supposed to look forward to death or do we hope it never comes? And fourth, do we think about death often? And you know, on the other hand, do we try not to think about death? And then lastly, are we expected to prepare for death, or do we just ignore it and pretend like it's not there? So some of these questions are more obvious than others, and we'll get into some of the ahadith and statements that are mentioned, and these questions will be answered kind of implicitly. So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said, "Akthiru dhikra hadhihi al-ladhat," which means maut. So remember often the destroyer of pleasures, which is death, right? And this is a hadith that I'm sure like most of us have heard very much. It's repeated a lot. And one thing it's important to mention here is that when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is saying "Akthiru dhikra hadhihi al-ladhat," he's saying that the importance of death as a reminder for the Muslim, so that he remembers that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to hold him accountable, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to raise him back from the dead, and he's going to be held accountable for every single thing he did. That's why it's so important to akthiru dhikr, to do it so much that, again, remember death and go to janazas and go to azas and go to these kind of things. And we have a culture these days of kind of avoiding this topic, and if it is brought up, it's kind of closed quickly, or it's uncomfortable, etc. And this is again the opposite of this hadith that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is telling to do. Now, a hadith maybe some of us haven't heard before. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he says, "Man ahabba liqa'a Allah ahabba Allah liqa'ah, wa man kariha liqa'a Allah kariha Allah liqa'ah." So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said that whoever loves to meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves to meet him. And whoever dislikes to meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala dislikes to meet him. And so the Sahaba, when they heard this, they responded, they said, فَقُلْتُ يَا نَبِيَ اللَّهِ كَرَاهِيَةُ الْمَوْتِ. So he's asking a question, he's saying, "O Prophet of Allah, are you talking about disliking death?" And so after that, he says a very important statement, and again, this is a Sahabi, remember this. And if I remember correctly, this hadith narrated by Anas ibn Malik. He says, فَكُلُّنَا نَكْرَهُ الْمَوْتِ, because all of us dislike or hate death. So, and again, these are questions we have to ponder about, and we're going to get answers for in this session. That we know in another hadith, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam mentions wahin, and he says wahin is a disease that will come upon us ummah, and the meaning of wahin is hubbud dunya wa karahiyatul maut, is the love of dunya and the hatred of death. And here the same word is used. It says karahiyatul maut in the definition of wahin, and over here the Sahabi is saying فَكُلُّنَا نَكْرَهُ الْمَوْتِ. So all of us dislike death. So isn't this against the meaning of wahin? So what's going on? There has to be some way to understand this, right? And so Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he says, قال ليس كذلك, it's not like that. ولكن المؤمن إذا بشر برحمة الله ورضوانه وجنته أحب لقاء الله وأحب الله لقاءه وإن الكافر إذا بشر بعذاب الله وسخطه كره لقاء الله وكره الله لقاءه. It's not like that, but rather when the believer is given glad tidings of Allah's mercy, His subhanahu wa ta'ala's pleasure in paradise, he loves to meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves to meet him. But when the disbeliever is given glad tidings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's punishment and his anger, he dislikes to meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala dislikes to meet him. So at first, when you're hearing this, it might be a little bit confusing. And so I brought a statement from An-Nawawi where he says, معنى الحديث أن حبهم لقاء الله سبب حب الله لهم. That the meaning of this hadith is not that their love of meeting Allah is the cause of Allah's love for them. And he continues and he says, وَلَا أَنَّ كَرَاهَتَهُمْ سَبَبٌ لِكَرَاهَتِهِ. And nor that their dislike is the cause of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala disliking them. And he says, he continues, بل الغرض بيان وصفهم بأنهم يحبون لقاء الله حين أحب الله لقاءهم. انتهى كلامه. And so he says, what this actually means, the conclusion here, is that the purpose of this hadith, what the Prophet ﷺ is saying, is that is to describe them as loving to meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at the time Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves to meet them. So if you understand it this way, it's that love is an attribute of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the servant's love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala follows from it. And it's like a reflection of that. And so a hadith that clarifies this makes it very clear. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he says, when Allah loves a servant, he occupies him with himself subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the point here is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when he loves the servant, then the servant, because of this love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he loves Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's why if we go back to the hadith where Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he mentions that whoever loves to meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves to meet him, and then also the opposite. It's not simply that, if you just love to meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then therefore Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will love to meet you unconditionally. So the key point here is that this love has a clarification behind it, which is the fact that this person lives his life in accordance with Islam. And then when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brings him in front of him, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala showers him with his mercy, with his love, then the mu'min will please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this duality is very important. And again, the most clear ayah in the Quran, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned, قُلْ إِن كُنْتُمْ تُحِبُّونَ اللَّهَ فَاتَّبِعُونِي يُحْبِبْكُمُ اللَّهُ. That if you truly, speaking to Quraysh, if you truly love God, if you love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, فَاتَّبِعُونِي يُحْبِبْكُمُ اللَّهُ. So follow me, and then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will love you. So first comes Islam, submission, obedience, and then the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then this, of course, this believer will be more than pleased with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and he will love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And now the other key point that we hit on a little bit, which is the fact that people naturally dislike death, and the pain associated with death. But the measure is the person's actions in this life and their belief in the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the next life. So sometimes we think that when we hear, a hadith speaking about death, or even the one I mentioned before about wahy, that disliking death is something that is absolutely wrong, and a mu'min should not have this characteristic. This statement is correct if what's meant by disliking death is disliking leaving this world and disliking meeting Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But again, what we see from this hadith, the Sahaba are saying that we all dislike death because it's something that naturally humans dislike. They hate, it causes pain. But when put into the perspective that this believer is here in this dunya as a traveler, and then when death comes, and he knows death is coming to him for sure, and he prepares his entire life for death, when death comes, it's an opportunity for that person to be in the most just court, which is the court of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Like sometimes we think that, how can I, for example, with all the sins that I commit, how can I be admitted into Jannah, right? With all these different mistakes that I make, and all these different, like things that you fall for, right? When you are in the court of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, no one will be oppressed. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most just. Like over here in this dunya, you could have a court session which is conducted according to Sharia. You have a qadi, and you have witnesses, and you have someone who brings a claim, and the claim is evaluated, and the qadi evaluates it from a Sharia perspective, and a ruling is given, and that person might get an easy ruling, a harsh ruling, whatever the ruling is, from this qadi, who derived it from the Quran and Sunnah, but he might not be held in absolute justice. And this is why, for example, Ibn Ashur, he mentions in tafsir of the ayah, لِيَقُومَ النَّاسُ بِالْقِسْطِ in Surah Al-Hadid, where Allah speaks about how he sent the messengers and the books and the bayinat and all of this in the scale, so that these prophets will establish justice in the land. He mentions that this justice that's spoken about in this ayah is not absolute justice because it doesn't exist in this dunya. It doesn't exist. In this dunya you have partial justice, which is the justice of is implementing the sharia of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and therefore bringing about this mercy and this justice to mankind according to the capacity of human beings, which is again a limitation. When you're with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there is no limitation according to this. So again, this is the perspective that someone has, that when he meets Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala after death, he's in the most just court and he longs for the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The Hadith Qudsi says, "Ana 'inda dhanni 'abdi bi," that I am where my servant thinks of me. So if you think of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as, someone who is unforgiving and punishing and is going to, get revenge and these kind of things, these negative characteristics, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that this is what your outcome will be. Versus the person who understands Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has the attributes he mentioned in the Quran, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most merciful, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can forgive any sin, then his actions are different, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will be that way towards him. And so, Samarqandi, he says, after this, he says, "من أيقن بالموت وعلم أنه نازل به لا محالة فلا بد له من الاستعداد له بالأعمال الصالحة وبالاجتناب عن الأعمال الخبيثة فإنه لا يدري متى ينزل به." Whoever is certain of death and knows that it will inevitably befall him, it will for sure befall him, must prepare for it with righteous deeds and by avoiding evil deeds, for he does not know when it will come upon him. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has written down an ajal, which is a specific lifespan that will come to an end at a specific time. The circumstances around death could be different. And just to think about this for a second, we see examples in this world where someone could be shot, for example, in an injury that is, for example, might not necessarily be considered fatal, and that person might end up dying. Or, for example, someone could be shot and has a fatal injury, and that person ends up surviving. So there are circumstances around death, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has placed a specific time for death to come to you, and nothing can cause that time to come except when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decrees that time to be there. So it is a very a beautiful statement of Ali ibn Abi Talib radiallahu anhu, where he says, and for context actually, when he used to fight in battles, he used to be like, just by himself, he would just go in and he'd be surrounded by the enemy. He used to go deep into the enemy territory. And so Sahaba used to say to him that, "Oh Ali, like at least come back a little bit so we can watch your back and watch your side, like, so we can help you out." And he responds to them, he says, "Nahnu qawmun tahmina ajaluna," that we are a people who are protected by our lifespan. So my time of death is protecting me in this dunya. It's a shield for me. Because it doesn't matter what kind of harm comes my way, what kind of benefit comes my way, it doesn't matter what happens to me in this dunya, there is a specific time where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will pull this soul out of my body, and nothing can bring it forward or back. And again, this is the attitude that Islam puts into the Muslims. And we see that Khalid ibn Walid radiallahu anhu, when speaking to the Romans and sending them this letter of explaining Islam, da'wah to Islam, and the three options they have, he mentions at the end, if you don't accept one of these options, أتيتكم برجال يحبون الموت كما تحبون الحياة, then I will come to you with men who love death the same way you love life. يحبون الموت كما تحبون الحياة. And the reason why, again, hub here is more accurate, like hirs. Hirs in Arabic means like going, striving and putting a lot of importance and doing everything you can to make sure this thing is correct. So disbelievers, non-Muslims, harisin al hayat, they're very worried and careful and striving and making sure that this life this is it. Because to them, they don't see anything more than that. And again, this is something that we're all the most familiar with when you live over here, that these ideas of like you only live once, or ideas that you have to, you have one chance in this life and you have to make use of it and do as much as you can, have the most fun you can. Whereas Islam flips that concept on its back and says, you have one chance at life over here. Your actions will be held accountable in the court of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So make use of this so that you can live eternally in happiness. Even a disbeliever's happiness is constricted to this life. Constricted. Versus the believers, like Khalid is saying, يُحِبُّونَ الْمَوْتِ. Why do they love death? Because they love the preparation related to death of meeting Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And again, this is the point that Samarqandi is mentioning over here. And then he mentions that Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said, قَالَ لِرَجُلٍ وَهُوَ يَعِذُهُ. He said to a man as he's like giving a reminder, or like a speech. اغتنم خمسا قبل خمس. Take care of 5 before 5. شبابك قبل هرمك. Your youth before your old age. وصحتك قبل سقمك. And your health before your illness. وفراغك قبل شغلك. And your free time, or your time to allocate to other things, before you're very busy and you don't have time. وغناك قبل فقرك. And your wealth, or your the lot of wealth that you have, that you accumulated, before you're poor and you don't have that wealth to spend. وحياتك قبل موتك. And your life before your death. So again, notice if we go back to the 5 questions we mentioned in the beginning. We mentioned that in terms of death, do we like it or do we hate it? If we answer this question now, looking at the hadith that were mentioned and the statements from Samarqandi, death is something that we prepare for, and we love to meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Although that might not mean that death itself, the pain associated with it, is something that we naturally hate. Rather, it's the preparation associated with death in this dunya of doing good deeds and meeting Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the most just of just in His court. That is what we love about death. And again, that's why if you reference back to the beginning, we spoke about wahan, we said حُبُّ الدُّنْيَا وَكَرَاهِيَةُ الْمَوْتِ, that when the definition of wahan is given as love of dunya and hatred of death. Hatred of death over here is because the actions are reflected by this. So again, the description of this hadith speaking about the ummah being, the Muslims being, كَغُثَاءِ السَّيْلِ, like the foam of the sea. Again, because of the actions associated, the characteristic given is wahan, which is love of this dunya, meaning attachment of this dunya, and karahiyatul maut, and hatred of death because you don't see this akhirah and you don't prepare for this akhirah. And then the second one of, do we fear death or do we accept it? The answer to that is, it should be very, very clear. When the Quran says, إِنَّكَ مَيِّتٌ وَإِنَّهُمْ مَيِّتُونَ, that you, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, you will pass away, you will die, and they will also die. And so we not just, we definitely don't fear death, right? And we accept it. We definitely accept it in the sense that we see death as something that is yaqeen. It is certainty that will come to every single one of us. And so therefore we prepare for it. And a similar attitude towards the Day of Judgment. And again, to give this dichotomy, make it even clearer. Also He says in the Quran, إِنَّهُمْ يَرَوْنَهُ بَعِيدًا وَنَرَاهُ قَرِيبًا, that they see the Day of Judgment or death and this accountability as so far away that when the Prophet comes to them and explains to them these truths, their response is, okay, even if you're right, this is so far away. Like, well, I don't have to worry about this right now. إِنَّهُمْ يَرَوْنَهُ بَعِيدًا وَنَرَاهُ قَرِيبًا, and we see it as very, very close. And again, the point of seeing it as close and not far away, why we have an attitude that death can always come to me right now, is because that keeps me in a state of obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because I know I might die right now. My soul might be removed as I'm speaking right now, and now I'm in my grave being held accountable for what I've done in this life. So that perspective keeps the mu'min very active in striving for the akhirah. And then, do we look forward to death? And do we hope it never comes? So this question, of course, it's definitely not the second one, right? Do we hope it never comes? Of course not, because that would be like the definition of ghurur, which is like what shaitan in the Quran mentions, that the shaitan will deceive people in this life, and he uses the word ghurur, and shaitan is referred to in the Quran as al-ghurur. وَغَرَّهُ بِاللَّهِ غَرُورٌ, that this chief, like the translation in English is chief deceiver, but more accurately the meaning is that shaitan convinces you of a certain idea that shrouds the truth. So shaitan convinces you that you have time. Shaitan convinces you that what you're doing is okay. Shaitan convinces you that, this might not even be true. And then he shrouds the fact that this is close, this is happening, this is the truth, and you have to prepare for it. And so, the mu'min, he looks forward to death if he did good in this life. And now we have to pause right here because this is very, very important. That, and there's a very good example of this in the Quran. In Surah Al-Ahzab, Surah Al-Jumu'ah. The mu'min the human being actually, who was a believer and did righteous deeds in this life, this person looks forward to death because he's looking forward to being held accountable for what he did, and he knows Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will reward him for that. Versus the human being who, regardless of whether Muslim or non-Muslim, did bad in this life, did not do righteous deeds, then he will be fearful of death. He'll be very fearful of death. And he won't want death to come. And this is like to mention one ayah, to get a picture of this. This is in Surah Al-Ahzab, speaking about the munafiqeen, how during this, this very difficult time, this difficult ghazwa, difficult battle, there was amongst them people who tried to flee, who tried to turn away from this and run away from what they saw as guaranteed defeat and death. The Quran says, قُلْ لَن يَنْفَعَكُمُ الْفِرَارُ إِنْ فَرَرْتُمْ مِنَ الْمَوْتِ أَوِ الْقَتْلِ وَإِذًا لَا تُمَتَّعُونَ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا. That, say, O Prophet, speaking to them, fleeing will not benefit you if you try to escape a natural, like a violent death. And if it's not your time, you will only be allowed to enjoy a little. So this is the translation in English. But if we go to the Arabic, قُلْ لَن يَنْفَعَكُمُ الْفِرَارُ إِنْ فَرَرْتُمْ مِنَ الْمَوْتِ, that it will not benefit you running away if you try to run away from death, أَوِ الْقَتْلِ, or even being killed, because death and a natural death versus being killed are two different things. That a human being might, again by shaitan, might think that, at least if I avoid fighting in this battle, or avoid facing this harm, or speaking the truth, for example, in the face of a tyrant, and then therefore I might be killed, or etc. Shaitan convinces you of this idea, when in reality, death can come to you right now. Even if you avoid that harsh environment, and that environment that might lead to your death can come to you right now. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes a very powerful statement here. He says, وَإِذًا لَا تُمَتَّعُونَ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا. And even if you aren't, your soul isn't pulled out from your body in that moment, in this battle, for example, لَا تُمَتَّعُونَ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا. Even then you'll only have this life of yours, or this enjoyment. The Arabic word here is enjoyment. This enjoyment, you'll only have it for a very small amount of time. قُلْ مَنْ ذَا الَّذِي يَعْصِمُكُم مِّنَ اللَّهِ إِنْ أَرَادَ بِكُمْ سُوءًا أَوْ أَرَادَ بِكُمْ رَحْمَةً. That Allah is asking a rhetorical question, of course. Who can put you out of the reach of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala intends to harm you or show you mercy? وَلَا يَجِدُونَ لَهُ مِن دُونِ اللَّهِ وَلِيًّا وَلَا نَصِيرًا. And then the clarification comes in that this is an absolute truth, that you will not find anyone other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as a wali or nasir, as someone who is a protector or a close friend or a helper, other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we have to have this perspective in this life, and death is a very powerful reminder of this. And then the last thing I'll mention is a statement of Salman al-Farisi, radiallahu anhu, that's narrated in this book. And he says, قال سلمان الفارسي رضي الله عنه ثلاث أعجبتني حتى أضحكتني. There's three things that I was fascinated by until they made me laugh. مؤمل الدنيا والموت يطلبه. The person who is hopes and seeks this worldly life, and death is seeking him. So look, this picture he's painting. In meaning here, يعني يطيل أمله ولا يتفكر في الموت, that he, his hope is so long, that I'll live for so long, when really death is coming, and he avoids thinking about death. وغافل وليس بمغفول عنه. And someone who is like ghafil, which is in English someone who is heedless. So this person is heedless, وَلَيْسَ بِمَغْفُولٍ عَنْهُ. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or death, is not heedless of him. So this person is heedless of death, not thinking about death, not thinking about accountability, but accountability is coming for him. And every single second that goes by, he is coming closer and closer and closer to that truth. وَضَاحِكٌ مِنْ أَفِيهِ وَلَا يَدْرِي أَسَاخِطٌ رَبِّ الْعَالَمِينَ عَلَيْهِ أَمْ رَاضٍ. And this is like a very important one. Someone who laughs so much with his mouth full, like that's the description over here, that someone laughs in such a manner that he's so happy and excited or whatever, not knowing whether Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is pleased with him or angry. So again, that's why we see that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, what's narrated about him is that when he used to laugh, it was a smile. And again, the purpose behind this is that the person is very focused. The mu'min has to be very focused in this dunya. Now again, does this mean that laughing is not allowed in Islam? Of course not. We just said that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam used to laugh, and he used to have, there's even narrations of Sahaba having fun in jokes that used to go between them. But again, the point here he's saying, Salman al-Farisi, is وَضَاحِكٌ مِنْ أَفِيهِ. And it's this huge, absolutely heedless type of laugh. And this type of laugh, and this is like a session that can go on for longer, and I think we did cover this topic in the Nawawi session, but laughing and this idea of joy, when it's pushed too far, it becomes a disease of the heart, and it makes the heart very hard to reminders that we're talking about right now, for example, like death. Someone who just enjoys life and never has a serious moment, when a reminder about death comes, again, like we said in the beginning, the attitude towards it is that, okay, this is very uncomfortable, it's very scary, etc. Let's close the topic as fast as we can. And then he says, وَثَلَاثٌ, and three other things, أَخْزَتْنِي حَتَّى أَبْكِتْنِي, that three things made me so sad, or made me grieve, until they made me cry. And so he says, فِرَاقُ الْأَحِبَّةِ مُحَمَّدٌ وَحِزْبًا, that I had to separate from those who I loved, which is Muhammad and his hizb, which is Muhammad and his friends, radiallahu anhu. وَهَوْلُ الْمَطْلَعِ, and the terrors of the grave and what lies ahead. And then he says, وَالْوُقُوفُ بَيْنَ يَدَيْ اللَّهِ وَلَا أَدْرِي إِلَى الْجَنَّةِ يُؤْمَرُ بِي أَوْ إِلَى النَّارِ, and standing before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not knowing whether I will be commanded to paradise or to the fire. So, and again, notice here that there is this, again, dichotomy of the fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the love and expectation of the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are things that we have hope in, and then, the punishment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the severity of the punishment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is something that we have, we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself to give us refuge from. So, and again, that concept itself, if you look at it from a non-Muslim perspective, and this is something that you'll see if you speak to non-Muslims, whether they're Christians and Jews or atheists even. When you tell them that you believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, a Lord who is all merciful and who is severe in punishment, they think of that as impossible. Like how does that even make sense? But on top of that, even we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for his mercy and seek refuge in him from his own punishment. So again, the perspective is when death comes to you and your soul is pulled out and you have to be held accountable for everything you did, you ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be given the reward, like we said last week, of ikhlas, with sincerity, the reward of your actions, and you ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive you for everything you fell into, and that you, of course, inshallah, you have tawfiq of making tawbah for that. You ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive you for that and divert you away from his punishment. So this is the attitude of a Muslim in a nutshell, and those are the answers of the first 5 questions that are supposed to frame our attitude towards death. And then the last thing is that the structure of this book, again, is he started with the ikhlas, and then this time he went over the concept of death, and then next he's going to go into the punishment of the grave and the severity of the punishment of the grave, and then after that going over Yawm al-Qiyamah and then after that continuing on to other topics. And again, the key point is that he started off with these topics because they're the foundation for the next topics. To speak about the rules of Tawbah or enjoying the good and forbidding the evil. These different topics, they have to have this precedence that you understand that you're here only with sincerity for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that you will guaranteed die one day, and then you'll be raised on Yawm al-Qiyamah and held accountable for everything you did. And with that, we'll pause here for questions and comments. Subhanakallah wa bihamdik. Ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta.